we're off the air. It's the end of an era on the Canadian airwaves. Beginning next season, Hockey Night in Canada will no longer air on CBC television on Saturday nights.
Last Saturday night, millions of Canadians sat down, turned on the TV, and heard that for the last time. Hockey Night in Canada has been on the air since 1952. 74 years. And as of this week, it's gone from CBC permanently. The company that ended it signed an $11 billion deal on the way out.
I understand it's a business. Everybody understands it's a business, but you can only push it so far before you start to lose people. And I think this is a failure at the NHL level.
Before we get to the money, and there's a lot of money, you need to understand what we're actually talking about. Hockey Night in Canada was not a sports broadcast. It was, for most of this country's history, the fixed point of Saturday. The thing you didn't schedule around. The thing everything else got scheduled around. It started on the radio, November 12th, 1931. Foster Hewitt called the very first game from Maple Leaf Gardens on the Canadian National Railway radio network. Within 2 years, 2.5 million Canadians were tuning in every week. By the time General Motors was sponsoring the broadcast, 3/4 of all radio listeners in the country were tuned to hockey on any given Saturday night. That's not a sports audience. That's a country organizing its week around a radio signal. When television arrived, Hockey Night came with it. October 11th, 1952. One of the earliest major sports broadcasts in Canadian TV history. The cameras were stationary. The puck was sometimes impossible to follow. Canadians watched anyway, because Foster Hewitt's voice was coming through the screen, and that was enough. And then CBC did something that almost no broadcaster in North American history has managed to do twice. It became the soundtrack to the most watched moment in Canadian sports history. September 28th, 1972, Game 8 of the Summit Series. Canada versus the Soviet Union, played in Moscow with the series tied. Businesses closed early, schools wheeled televisions into gymnasiums. By most estimates, somewhere between 12 and 16 million Canadians, more than half the country's population at the time, watched Paul Henderson score with 34 seconds remaining. Foster Hewitt called it on the radio, coming out of retirement specifically for the series.
Another shot, right by the score! Henderson has scored for Canada! Henderson!
The country heard it together on public airwaves because there was nowhere else to go and no one would have gone anywhere else anyway. Henderson's goal was later voted among the greatest moments in Canadian history in a Dominion Institute poll. That's what the CBC carried. Not games. Shared national experience delivered free into every home that had a television set. That's the weight the broadcast carried. Not just hockey, the moments that became Canadian memories. Then came Bob Cole on television, and 50 years of Saturday nights that followed the same shape. Cole called his first NHL television game for CBC in 1973 and stayed until April 6, 2019, when he called his final game at 85 years old between Montreal and Toronto, and he received a standing ovation from fans in a building where he'd spent decades working.
Oh, baby!
Became one of the most recognizable phrases in Canadian broadcasting. Players used to say they knew they'd made it when Bob Cole got excited about something they'd done.
Look at Lemieux! Oh my heavens! What a goal! What a move! Lemieux! Oh, baby! Mario Lemieux gets a goal! Is this a movie or what?
That is the institution we're talking about. 95 years from Foster Hewitt's first radio call to this past Saturday night. And most Canadians had no idea until this week how close it had been to ending for years. So how did we get here? The answer starts in 2013, and it involves a detail that almost nobody picked up on at the time. In November 2013, Rogers Communications signed a 12-year, $5.2 billion deal with the NHL for the Canadian broadcast rights to every game. Playoffs, Stanley Cup Final, all of it. the largest media rights deal in NHL history at the time. CBC kept Saturday nights. CBC kept the Hockey Night brand. CBC kept the personalities, the set, the theme, the audience trust built over 60 years of broadcasting. What CBC did not keep, what almost no one watching at home understood, was the advertising revenue. Let that land for a second. Every ad you saw during those Saturday night games, Rogers sold it and kept the money. The CBC, a public broadcaster funded by Canadian taxpayers, was putting its staff, its infrastructure, and its credibility on the air every Saturday night and handing the commercial revenue to a private telecom company. The first sub-licensing agreement ran 4 years, with a 1-year extension. Then, in 2019, Rogers and CBC signed another deal, 7 years this time, running through the end of the 2025-26 season. And here's the part that gets lost in the timeline. By 2019, both parties knew exactly what the arrangement was. CBC had been working under it for 5 years. They knew they received zero advertising revenue. They knew Rogers controlled the production, the editorial decisions, and the commercial inventory. They signed anyway, because the alternative was no hockey on CBC at all, and losing Hockey Night entirely was not something any CBC executive wanted to be responsible for. That's the trap. Once you're in it, the only leverage you have is your audience reach. The free, over-the-air signal that Rogers needed to maximize viewership and therefore advertising rates. The moment Rogers decided that audiences could be monetized through subscriptions instead, the arrangement had no value left for them, and there was nothing in the contract that required Rogers to care about what the CBC lost when it happened. So why did the NHL let this happen? Because they had every reason to stay out of it. In April 2025, Rogers signed a new 12-year deal with the NHL worth approximately $11 billion Canadian, roughly double what they paid in 2013. Rogers executives said publicly the deal would be immediately profitable. The NHL called it a landmark agreement and said nothing about free-to-air access for Canadian fans. This was not a surprise outcome. Rogers had been testing the paywall model for 2 years already. Starting with the 2024-25 season, they sub-licensed Monday night games to Amazon's Prime Video, exclusively behind a subscription paywall, the first time a national NHL package in Canada had gone digital only. No free option. No over-the-air alternative. You paid for Prime or you didn't watch Monday Night Hockey. That deal ran the final 2 years of the old Rogers NHL agreement. It worked, subscribers paid, the model held. So when the new $11 billion deal began, Rogers had proof that Canadian hockey fans would pay for games behind a subscription wall. The CBC arrangement, which cost Rogers the ad revenue from Saturday nights and requiring sharing the production with a public broadcaster, was no longer the most profitable use of the rights. The sub-licensing agreement with CBC expired at the end of this year's Stanley Cup playoffs. There was no renewal, no press conference. A joint statement was released. Both sides said the right things, and Hockey Night in Canada on CBC was over. Let's be specific about what Rogers actually did here, because the framing matters. They didn't cancel Hockey Night in Canada. The brand still exists. It's on Sportsnet. Games are still being called Hockey Night games. What changed is where those games live. Saturday Night Hockey, which your parents watched for free, which your grandparents watched for free, now requires a Sportsnet subscription to see. The question nobody in a boardroom seems to have asked out loud is, what happens to the kid whose family can't afford a Sportsnet subscription? The one who'd been watching games on CBC because it was free. No accounts, no credit card, no monthly fee, the way every generation before them took for granted. That access is gone. Not because the audience went somewhere else, because a contract expired and the math didn't support a renewal. The NHL got its record deal. CBC gets nothing. And the public broadcaster, which does retain Olympic and Paralympic broadcasting rights through 2032, is now announcing a new Saturday night primetime show highlighting Canadian athletes competing around the world. That's the replacement. Olympic coverage on a Saturday night slot that held hockey for 74 years. The CBC framed it as an opportunity. It's worth noting what they didn't say, that they'd found something to fill the gap. They found something to fill the time slots. Those are different things. There's a version of this story where you run the numbers and the logic holds. Rogers paid $11 billion for 12 years of rights. They need the return. The most direct route is keeping subscribers on Sportsnet, which means keeping games behind the paywall. Private companies don't preserve rituals. They monetize them. That's a coherent argument. But it doesn't account for what was actually lost. Hockey Night in Canada was the thing that told you the weekend had properly started. Not because it was particularly good television, though sometimes it was, but because it was there, reliably, every Saturday at the same time, for everyone, on a channel that cost nothing to receive. You didn't have to love hockey. You knew the theme song. The late game came through the wall of your childhood bedroom at 10 p.m. when you were supposed to be asleep, and the sound of it meant something without you ever deciding it would. That's gone now. The broadcast still exists, technically, but the version of it that belonged to everyone, that sat in the same category as public space, available without a fee, showing up whether or not you'd remember to renew anything, that's over. Rogers made it a product. Products require payments, and things that require payment stop being shared. The access point mattered more than people realized while it existed. Hockey Night on CBC was how this country's newest arrivals found the sport. You didn't need to understand a game to turn on the TV on a Saturday and have it explained to you season after season until it made sense. You didn't need to pay for it. The subscription model doesn't just inconvenience existing fans, it closes the door for the next generation of them. The ones who would have become fans if the game had simply been there, the way it always had been. 74 years of Saturday nights on CBC. 95 years from the first radio call to the last one. The longest running sports program in Canadian television history. And now a Saturday Night Olympics highlight show on the channel that used to carry the game. There's no version of this that comes back. The new Rogers deal runs until 2038. Rogers is already counting the money. The NHL got its record contract. And somewhere, a kid whose family doesn't have Sportsnet just lost the thing every Canadian generation before them had for free, and will grow up never knowing what they missed. Tell me your Hockey Night memories. The goal you remember, the voice you grew up with, the game that made you care about this sport. Drop it in the comments, because if that broadcast is going away, the least we can do is remember it properly. If you want to keep watching stories like this one before they're public, Healthy Scratch members get early access. Link is below. And if you're not subscribed yet, you've been watching a free broadcast. Might be a good time to support one while they still exist.